Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are beginning a work by the Scottish novelist, poet, and essayist James Hogg. This is his most famous work entitled The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, written by himself, with the detail of curious traditionary facts and other evidence by the editor. And with that said, I will begin. To the Honourable William Smith, Lord Provost of Glasgow, etc., etc., etc. This work is respectfully inscribed as a small mark of the editor's esteem for him as a man, and respect for him as a magistrate. The editor's narrative. It appears from tradition, as well as some parish registers, still extant, that the land of Dalcastle, or Dalchastle as it is often spelled, were possessed by a family of the name of Colwyn, about 150 years ago, and for at least a century previous to that period. That family was supposed to have been a branch of the ancient family of Calcún, and it is certain that from it springs the Cowans that spread towards the border. I find that in the year 1687, George Cowan succeeded his uncle of the same name in the lands of Dalchastle and Balgrenan. And this being all I can gather of the family from history to tradition, I must appeal to the remainder of the motley adventures of that house. But of the matter furnished by the latter of these powerful monitors, I have no reason to complain. It has been handed down to the world in unlimited abundance, and I am certain that in recording the hideous events which follow, I am only relating to the greater part of the inhabitants of at least 4 counties of Scotland, matters of which they were before perfectly well informed. This George was a rich man, or supposed to be so, and was married when considerably advanced in life to the sole heiress and reputed daughter of a Baillie Order of Glasgow. This proved a conjunction anything but agreeable to the parties contracting. It is well known that the Reformation principles had long before that time taken a powerful hold of the hearts and affections of the people of Scotland, although the feeling was by no means general or in equal degrees. And it so happened that this married couple felt completely at variance on the subject. Granting it to have been so, one would have thought that the laird, owing to his retired situation, would have been the one that inclined to the stern doctrines of the reformers, and that the young and gay dame from the city would have adhered to the free principles cherished by the court party, and indulged in rather to extremity, in opposition to the severe and carping contemporaries. The contrary, however, happened to be the case. The laird was what his country neighbours called a droll, careless chap, with a very limited proportion of the fear of God in his heart, and very nearly as little of the fear of man. The laird had not intentionally wronged or offended either of the parties, and perceived not the necessity of deprecating their vengeance. He had hitherto believed that he was living in most cordial terms with the greater part of the inhabitants of the earth, and with the powers above in particular. But woe be unto him if he was not soon convinced of the fallacy of such damning security. For his lady was the most severe and gloomy of all bigots to the principles of the Reformation. Hers were not the tenets of the great reformers, but theirs mightily overstrained and deformed. Theirs was an unguent hard to be swallowed, but hers was that unguent embittered and overheated until nature could not longer bear it. She had imbibed her ideas from the doctrines of one flaming predestinarian divine alone, and these were so rigid that they became a stumbling block to many of his brethren and a mighty handle for the enemies of his party to turn the machine of the state against them. The wedding festivities at Dalcastle partook of all the gaiety, not of that stern age, but of one previous to it. There was feasting, dancing, piping, and singing. The liquors were handed around in great fullness, the ale in large wooden bickers, and the brandy in capacious horns of oxen. The laird gave full scope to his homely glee. He danced, he snapped his fingers to the music, clapped his hands, and shouted at the turn of the tune. He saluted every girl in the hall whose appearance was anything tolerable, and requested of their sweethearts to take the same freedom with his bride by way of retaliation. But there she sat at the head of the hall, in still and blooming beauty, absolutely refusing to tread a single measure with any gentleman there. The only enjoyment in which she appeared to partake was in now and then stealing a word of sweet conversation with her favorite pastor about divine things, for he had accompanied her home after marrying her to her husband to see her fairly settled in her new dwelling. He addressed her several times by her new name, Mrs. Cowan, but she turned away her head disgusted, and looked with pity and contempt towards the old inadvertent sinner, capering away in the height of his unregenerated mirth. The minister perceived the workings of her pious mind, and thenceforward addressed her by the courteous title of Lady Dowcastle, which sounded somewhat better, as not coupling her name with one of the wicked. And there was too great reason to believe that for all the solemn vows she had come under, and these were of no ordinary binding, particularly on the laird's part, she at that time despised, if not abhorred him in her heart. The good parson again blessed her, and went away. She took leave of him with tears in her eyes, entreating him often to visit her in that heathen land of the Amorite, the Hittite, and the Girgashite, to which she assented on many solemn and qualifying conditions, and then the comely bride retired to her chamber to pray. It was customary in those days for the bridesman and maiden, and a few select friends, to visit the new married couple after they had retired to rest and drink a cup to their healths, their happiness, and a numerous posterity. But the laird delighted not in this. He wished to have his jewel to himself, and slipping away quietly from his jovial party, he retired to his chamber to his beloved, and bolted the door. He found her engaged with the writings of the evangelists, and terribly demure. The laird went up to caress her, but she turned away her head, and spoke of the follies of aged men, and something of the broad way that leadeth to destruction. The laird did not thoroughly comprehend this allusion, but being considerably flustered by drinking, and disposed to take all in good part, he only remarked, as he took off his shoes and stockings, that whether the way was broad or narrow, it was time that they were in their bed. "Sure, Mr. Colwyn, you won't go to bed tonight at such an important period of your life without first saying prayers for yourself and me." When she said this, the laird had his head down almost to the ground, loosing his shoe buckle. But when he heard of prayers on such a night, he raised his face suddenly up, which was all over as flushed and as red as a rose, and answered, "Prayers, mistress? Lord help your crazed head. Is this a night for prayers?" He had better have held his peace. There was such a torrent of profound divinity poured out upon him that the laird became ashamed both of himself and his new maid spouse, and wist not what to say, but the brandy helped him out. "It strikes me, my dear, that religious devotion would be somewhat out of place tonight," said he, "allowing that it is ever so beautiful and ever so beneficial. Were we to ride on the rigging of it at all times, would we not be constantly making a farce of it? It would be like reading the Bible and the jest book verse about, and would render the life of man a medley of absurdity and confusion. But against the cant of the bigot or the hypocrite, no reasoning can aught avail. If you would argue unto the end of life, the infallible creature must alone be right. So it proved with the laird. One scripture text followed another, not in the least connected, and one sentence of the profound Mr. Ringham's sermons after another, proving the duty of family worship, till the laird lost patience, and, tossing himself into bed, said carelessly that he would leave that duty upon her shoulders for one night. The meek mind of Lady Dowcastle was somewhat disarranged by this sudden evolution. She felt that she was left rather in an awkward situation. However, to show her unconscionable spouse that she was resolved to hold fast her integrity, she kneeled down and prayed in terms so potent that she deemed sure she was making an impression on him. She did so, for in a short time the laird began to utter a response so fervent that she was utterly astounded, and fairly driven from the chain of her orisons. He began, in truth, to sound a nasal bugle of no ordinary caliber, the notes being little inferior to those of a military trumpet. The lady tried to proceed, but every returning note from the bed burst on her ear with a louder twang and a longer peal, till the concord of sweet sounds became so truly pathetic that the meek spirit of the dame was quite overcome, and after shedding a flood of tears she arose from her knees and retired to the chimney-corner with her Bible in her lap, there to spend the hours in holy meditation till such time as the inebriated trumpeter should awaken to a sense of propriety. The laird did not awake in any reasonable time, for, being overcome with fatigue and wassail, his sleep became sounder, and his morphine measures more intense. These varied a little on their structure, but the general run of the bars sounded something in this way: hic-hoc-hoo. It was most profoundly ludicrous, and could not have missed exciting risibility in anyone save a pious, a disappointed, a humble bride. The good dame wept bitterly. She could not for her life go and awaken the monster and request him to make room for her, but she retired somewhere, for the laird, on awakening the next morning, found that he was still lying alone. His sleep had been of the deepest and most genuine sort, and all the time that it lasted he had never once thought of either wives, children, or sweethearts, save in the way of dreaming about them. But as his spirit began again by slow degrees to verge towards the boundaries of reason, it became lighter and more buoyant from the effects of deep repose, and his dreams partook of that buoyancy, yea, to a degree hardly expressible. He dreamed of the reel, the jig, the strathspey, and the corrent, and the elasticity of his frame was such that he was bounding over the heads of the maidens and making his feet skimmer against the ceiling, enjoying the while the most ecstatic emotions. These grew too fervent for the shackles of the drowsy god to restrain. The nasal bugle ceased its prolonged sounds in one moment, and a sort of hectic laugh took its place. "Keep it going! Play up, you devils!" cried the laird, without changing his position on the pillow. But this exertion to hold the fiddlers at their work fairly awakened the delighted dreamer, and though he could not refrain from continuing his laugh, he at length, by tracing out a regular chain of facts, came to be sensible of his real situation. "Rowena, where are you? What's become of you, my dear?" cried the laird. But there was no voice, nor any one that answered or regarded. He flung open the curtains, thinking to find her still on her knees as he had seen her. But she was not there, either sleeping or waking. "Rowena! Mrs. Colwyn!" shouted he as loud as he could call, and then added in the same breath, "God save the king! I have lost my wife!" He sprung up and opened the casement. The daylight was beginning to streak the east, for it was spring, and the nights were short, and the mornings very long. The laird half dressed himself in an instant, and strode through every room in the house, opening their windows as he went, and scrutinizing every bed and every corner. He came into the hall where the wedding festival had held, and as he opened the various window boards, loving couples flew off like hares, surprised too late in the morning among the early braid. "Hoo, boo! Fee be frightened!" cried the laird. "Fee rin like fools, as if ye were caught in an ill turn." His bride was not among them, so he was obliged to betake himself to farther search. "She will be praying in some corner, poor woman," he said to himself. "It is an unlucky thing, this praying. But for my part I fear I have behaved very ill, and I must endeavour to make amends." The laird continued his search, and at length found his beloved in the same bed with her Glasgow cousin, who had acted as bridesmaid. "You sly and malevolent imp," said the laird, "you have played me such a trick when I was fast asleep. I have not known a frolic so clever, and at the same time so severe. Come along, you baggage you." "Sir, I will let you know that I detest your principles and your person alike," said she. "It shall never be said, sir, that my person was at the control of a heathenish man of Belial. a dangler among the daughters of women, a promiscuous dancer, and a player at unlawful games. Forego your rudeness, sir, I say, and depart from my presence, and that of my kinswoman. Come along, I say, my charming Reb. If you were the pink of all the Puritans, and the saint of all the saints, you are my wife, and must do as I command you. Sir, I will sooner lay down my life than be subjected to your godless will. Therefore I say, desist, and be gone with you. But the laird regarded none of these testy sayings. He rolled her in a blanket, and bore her triumphantly away to his chamber, taking care to keep a fold or two of the blanket always rather near to her mouth, in case of any outrageous forthcoming of noise. The next day at breakfast the bride was long in making her appearance. Her maid asked to see her, but George did not choose that anybody should see her but himself. He paid her several visits, and always turned the keys as he came out. At length breakfast was served, and during the time of refreshment the laird tried to break several jokes, but it was remarked that they wanted their accustomed brilliancy, and that his nose was particularly red at the top. Matters, without all doubt, had been very bad between the new married couple, for in the course of the day the lady deserted her quarters and returned to her father's house in Glasgow, after having been a night on the road, stage-coaches and steamboats having then no existence in that quarter. Though Bailey Ord had acquiesced in his wife's asseveration regarding the likeness of their only daughter to her father, he never loved or admired her greatly. Therefore this behavior nothing astounded him. He questioned her strictly as to the grievous offense committed against her, and could discover nothing that warranted a procedure so fraught with disagreeable consequences. So, after mature deliberation, the baillie addressed her as follows. Rebby, and say I find that Dowcastle has actually refused to say prayers with you when you ordered him, and has gidded you in a rude and delicate manner, outstepping the respect due to my daughter, as my daughter, but regard to what is due to his own wife, of that he's a better judge nor me. However, since he has behaved in that manner to my daughter, I shall be revenged on him for aince, for I shall return the obligation to and near him. That is, I shall take penny's worth of his wife, and let him lick at that. What do you mean, sir? Said the astonished damsel. I mean to be revenged on that the villain Dowcastle, said he, for what he has done to my daughter. Come hither, Mrs. Culwin. You shall pay for this. So saying, the baillie began to inflict corporal punishment on the runaway wife. His strokes were not indeed very deadly, but he made a mighty flourish in the infliction, pretending to be in a great rage only at the Laird of Dowcastle. Villain that he is, exclaimed he, I shall teach him to behave in such a manner to a child of mine. Be she as she may, since I cannot get at him myself, I shall lounder at her that is nearest to him in life. Take you that, and that, Mrs. Culwin, for your husband's impertinence. The poor afflicted woman wept and prayed, but the baillie would not abate aught of his severity. After fuming and beating her with many stripes, far drawn and lightly laid down, he took her up to her chamber, 5 stories high, locked her in, and there he fed her on bread and water, all to be revenged on the presumptuous Laird of Dowcastle. But ever and anon, as the baillie came down the stair from carrying his daughter's meal, he said to himself, I shall make the sight of the laird the blithest she ever saw in her life. Lady Dowcastle got plenty of time to read and pray and meditate, but she was at a great loss for one to dispute with about religious tenets, for she found that without this advantage, about which there was a perfect rage at that time, her reading and learning of Scripture, texts, and sentences of intricate doctrine availed her not. So she was oft driven to sit at her casement and look out for the approach of the heathenish Laird of Dowcastle. That hero, after a considerable lapse of time, at length made his appearance. Matters were not hard to adjust, for his lady found that there was no refuge for her in her father's house, and so, after some sighs and tears, she accompanied her husband home. For all that had passed, things went on no better. She would convert the laird in spite of his teeth. The laird would not be converted. She would have the laird to say family prayers, both morning and evening. The laird would neither pray morning nor evening. He would not even sing psalms and kneel beside her while she performed the exercise. Neither would he converse at all times and in all places about the sacred mysteries of religion, although his lady took occasion to contradict flatly every assertion that he made, in order that she might spiritualize him by drawing him into an argument. The laird kept his temper a long while, but at length his patience wore out. He cut her short in all her futile attempts at spiritualization, and mocked at her wire-drawn degrees of faith, hope, and repentance. He also dared to doubt of the great standard doctrine of absolute predestination, which put the crown on the lady's Christian resentment. She declared her helpmate to be a limb of Antichrist, and one with whom no regenerated person could associate. She therefore bespoke a separate establishment, and before the expiry of the first 6 months, the arrangements of the separation were amicably adjusted. The upper or third story of the old mansion house was awarded to the lady for her residence. She had a separate door, a separate stair, a separate garden, and walks that in no instance intersected the laird's, so that one would have thought the separation complete. They had each their own parties, selected from their own sort of people, and though the laird never once chafed himself about the lady's companies, it was not long before she began to intermeddle about some of his. "Who is that fat, bouncing dame that visits the laird so often and always by herself?" said she to her maid Martha one day. "Oh, dear, ma'am, how can I ken? We're banished frae our acquaintances here, as well as frae the sweet gospel ordinances. Find me out who that jolly dame is, Martha. You who hold communion with the household of this ungodly man can be at no loss to attain this information. I observe that she always casts her eye towards our windows, both in coming and going, and I suspect that she seldom departs from the house empty-handed." That same evening Martha came with the information that this august visitor was a Miss Logan, an old and intimate acquaintance of the laird's, and a very worthy, respectable lady of good connections, whose parents had lost their patrimony in the civil wars. "Ha! Very well," said the lady. "Very well, Martha. But nevertheless, go thou and watch this respectable lady's motions and behavior the next time she comes to visit the laird, and the next after that. You will not, I see, lack opportunities." Martha's information turned out of the nature that prayers were said in the uppermost story of Dowcastle House against the Canaanitish woman, every night and every morning. And great discontent prevailed there, even to anathemas and tears. Letter after letter was dispatched to Glasgow, and at length, to the lady's great consolation, the Reverend Mr. Ringham arrived safely and devoutly in her elevated sanctuary. Marvelous was the conversation between these gifted people. Ringham had held in his doctrines that were 8 different kinds of faith, all perfectly distinct in their operations and effects. But the lady, in her secluded state, had discovered other 5, making 12 in all. The adjusting of the existence or fallacy of these 5 faiths served for a most enlightened discussion of nearly 17 hours, in the course of which the two got warm in their arguments, always in proportion as they receded from nature, utility, and common sense. Ringham at length got into unwonted fervor about some disputed point between one of these faiths and trust, when the lady, fearing that zeal was getting beyond its wonted barrier, broke in on his vehement asseverations with the following abrupt discomfiture. "But, sir, as long as I remember what is to be done with the case of open and avowed iniquity." The minister was struck dumb. He leaned him back on his chair, stroked his beard, hemmed, considered, and hemmed again, and then said in an altered and softened tone, "Why, that is a secondary consideration. You mean the case between your husband and Miss Logan?" "The same, sir. I am scandalized at such intimacies going on under my nose. The sufferance of it is a great and crying evil." "Evil, madame, may be either operative or passive. To them it is an evil, but to us none. We have no more to do with the sins of the wicked and unconverted here than with those of an infidel Turk, for all earthly bonds and fellowships are absorbed and swallowed up in the holy community of the Reformed Church. However, if it is your wish, I shall take him to task and reprimand and humble him in such a manner that he shall be ashamed of his doings, and renounce such deeds forever, out of mere self-respect, though all unsanctified the heart as well as the deed may be. To the wicked all things are wicked, but to the just all things are just and right. Ah, that is a sweet and comfortable saying, Mr. Ringham. How delightful to think that a justified person can do no wrong. Who would not envy the liberty wherewith we are made free? Go to my husband, that poor unfortunate blindfolded person, and open his eyes to his degenerate and sinful state, for well are you fitted to the task. Yea, I will go in unto him and confound him. I will lay the strongholds of sin and Satan as flat before my face as the dung that is spread out to fatten the land. Master, there's a gentleman at the fore door, wants a private word o' ye. Tell him I am engaged. I cannot see any gentleman tonight, but I shall attend on him tomorrow as soon as he pleases. He's coming straight in, sir. Stop a wee bit. Sir, my master is engaged. He cannot see you at present, sir. Stand aside, thou Moabite. My mission admits of no delay. I come to save him from the jaws of destruction. And that be the case, sir, it makes a wide difference, and as the danger may threaten us, I fancy I may as well let ye gang by as fight with ye, seeing ye seem so intent on it. The man says he's coming to save ye, and cannot stop, sir. Here he is. The laird was going to break out into a volley of wrath against Waters, his servant, but before he got a word pronounced, the Reverend Mr. Ringham had stepped inside the room, and Waters had retired, shutting the door behind him. No introduction could be more malapropos. It is impossible, for at that very moment the laird and Arabella Logan were both sitting on one seat and both looking on one book, when the door opened. "What is it, sir?" said the laird fiercely. "A message of the greatest importance, sir," said the divine, striding unceremoniously up to the chimney, turning his back to the fire and his face to the culprits. "I think you should know me, sir," continued he, looking displeasedly at the laird, with his face half turned round. "I think I should," returned the laird. "You are a Mr. Howlstickham of Glasgow, who did me the worst turn ever I got done to me in my life. You gentry are always ready to do a man such a turn. Pray, sir, did you ever do a good job for anyone to counterbalance that? For if you have not, you ought to be. Hold, sir, I say, none of your profanity before me. If I do evil to anyone on such occasions, it is because he will have it so. Therefore the evil is not of my doing. I ask you, sir, before God and this witness, I ask you, have you kept solemnly and inviolate the vows which I laid upon you that day? Answer me. Has the partner whom you bound me to kept hers inviolate? Answer me that, sir. None can better do so than you, Mr. Howlstickham. So then you confess your backslidings and avow the profligacy of your life. And this person here is, I suppose, the partner of your iniquity, she whose beauty hath caused you to err. Stand up, both of you, till I rebuke you, and show you what you are in the eyes of God and man. In the first place, stand you still there, till I tell you what you are in the eyes of God and man. You are, sir, a presumptuous, self-conceited pedagogue, a stirrer-up of strife and commotion in church, in state, in families and communities. You are one, sir, whose righteousness consists in splitting the doctrines of Calvin into thousands of undistinguishable films, and in setting up a system of justifying grace against all breaches of all laws, moral or divine. In short, sir, you are a mildew, a cankerworm in the bosom of the Reformed Church, generating a disease of which she will never be purged, but by the shedding of blood. Go thou in peace, and do these abominations no more, but humble thyself lest a worse reproof come upon thee. Ringham heard all this without flinching. He now and then twisted his mouth in disdain, treasuring up, meantime, his vengeance against the two aggressors, for he felt he had them on the hip, and resolved to pour out his vengeance and indignation upon them. Sorry am I that the shackles of modern decorum restrain me from penning that famous rebuke, fragments of which have been attributed to every divine of old notoriety throughout Scotland. But I have it by heart, and a glorious morsel it is to put into the hands of a certain incendiaries. The metaphors were so strong and so appalling that Miss Logan could only stand them a very short time. She was obliged to withdraw in confusion. The laird stood his ground with much ado, though his face was often crimsoned over with the hues of shame and anger. Several times he was on the point of turning the officious sycophant to the door, but good manners and an inherent respect that he entertained for the clergy as the immediate servants of the Supreme Being restrained him. Ringham, perceiving these symptoms of resentment, took them for marks of shame and contrition, and pushed his reproaches farther than ever Devine ventured to do in a similar case. When he had finished, to prevent further discussion, he walked slowly and majestically out of the apartment, making his robes to swing behind him in a most magisterial manner, he being without doubt elated with his high conquest. He went to the upper story and related to his metaphysical associate his wonderful success, how he had driven the dame from the house in tears and deep confusion, and left the backsliding laird in such a quandary of shame and repentance that he could neither articulate a word nor lift up his countenance. The dame thanked him most cordially, lauding his friendly zeal and powerful eloquence, and then the two again set keenly to the splitting of hairs and making distinctions in religion where none existed. They being both children of adoption, and secured from falling into snares, or in any way under the power of the wicked one, it was their custom on each visit to sit up a night in the same apartment, for the sake of sweet spiritual converse. But that time, in the course of the night, they differed so materially on a small point, somewhere between justification and final election, that the minister, in the heat of his zeal, sprung up from his seat, paced the floor, and maintained his point with such ardor that Martha was alarmed, and thinking they were going to fight, and that the minister would be a hard match for her mistress, she put on some clothes, and twice left her bed, and stood listening at the back of the door, ready to burst in should need require it. Should anyone think this picture overstrained, I can assure him that it is taken from nature and from truth. But I will not likewise aver that the theologist was neither crazed nor inebriated. If the listener's words were to be relied on, there was no love, no accommodating principle manifested between the two, but a fiery burning zeal relating to points of such minor importance that a true Christian would blush to hear them mentioned, and the infidel and profane make a handle of them to turn our religion to scorn. Great was the dame's exultation at the triumph of her beloved pastor over her sinful neighbors in the lower parts of the house, and she boasted of it to Martha in high-sounding terms. But it was of short duration, for in 5 weeks after that, Arabella Logan came to reside with the laird as his housekeeper, sitting at his table and carrying the keys as mistress substitute of the mansion. The lady's grief and indignation were now raised to a higher pitch than ever, and she set every agent to work with whom she had any power to effect a separation between these two suspected ones. Remonstrance was of no avail. George laughed at them who tried such a course, and retained his housekeeper, while the lady gave herself up to utter despair. For though she would not consort with her husband herself, she could not endure that any other should do so. But to countervail this grievous offense, our saintly and afflicted dame, in due time, was safely delivered of a fine boy, whom the laird acknowledged as his son and heir, and had him christened by his own name, and nursed in his own premises. He gave the nurse permission to take the boy to his mother's presence, if ever she should desire to see him. But strange as it may appear, she never once desired to see him from the day that he was born. The boy grew up and was a helpful and happy child, and in the course of another year the lady presented him with a brother. A brother he certainly was in the eye of the law, and it was more than probable that he was his brother in reality. But the laird thought otherwise, and though he knew and acknowledged that he was obliged to support and provide for him, he refused to acknowledge him in other respects. He neither would countenance the banquet, nor take the baptismal vows on him in the child's name. Of course, the poor boy had to live and remain an alien from the visible church for a year and a day, at which time Mr. Ringham, out of pity and kindness, took the lady herself as sponsor for the boy, and baptized him by the name of Robert Ringham. that being the noted divine's own name. George was brought up with his father and educated partly at the parish school and partly at home by a tutor hired for the purpose. He was a generous and kind-hearted youth, always ready to oblige and hardly ever dissatisfied with anybody. Robert was brought up with Mr. Ringham, the laird paying a certain allowance for him yearly, and there the boy was early inured to all the sternness and severity of his pastor's arbitrary and unyielding creed. He was taught to pray twice every day and 7 times on Sabbath days, but he was only to pray for the elect, and like David of old, doom all that were aliens from God to destruction. He had never, in that family into which he had been as it were adopted, heard aught but evil spoken of his reputed father and brother. Consequently, he held them in utter abhorrence, and prayed against them every day, often that the old hoary sinner might be cut off in the full flush of his iniquity, and be carried quick into hell, and that the young stem of the corrupt trunk might also be taken from a world that he disgraced, but that his sins might be pardoned because he knew no better. Such were the tenets in which it would appear young Robert was bred. He was an acute boy, an excellent learner, had ardent and ungovernable passions, and withal a sternness of demeanor from which other boys shrunk. He was the best grammarian, the best reader, writer, and accountant in the various classes that he attended, and was fond of writing essays on controverted points of theology, for which he got prizes and great praise from his guardian and mother. George was much behind him in scholastic acquirements, but greatly his superior in personal prowess, form, feature, and all that constitutes gentility in deportment and appearance. The laird had often manifested to Miss Logan an earnest wish that the 2 young men should never meet, or at all events that they should be as little conversant as possible. And Miss Logan, who was as much attached to George as if he had been her own son, took every precaution, while he was a boy, that he should never meet with his brother. But as they advanced towards manhood, this became impracticable. The lady was removed from her apartments in her husband's house to Glasgow, to her great content, and all to prevent the young laird being tainted with the company of her and her second son, for the laird had felt the effects of the principles they professed and dreaded them more than persecution, fire, and sword. During all the dreadful times that had overpassed, though the laird had been a moderate man, he had still leaned to the side of the kingly prerogative, and had escaped confiscation and fines without ever taking any active hand in suppressing the Covenanters. But after experiencing a specimen of their tenets and manner in his wife from a secret favorer of them and their doctrines, he grew alarmed at the prevalence of such stern and factious principles, now that there was no check nor restraint upon them, and from that time he began to set himself against them, joining with the Cavalier party of that day in all their proceedings. It so happened that under the influence of the Earls of Seafield and Tullibardine, he was returned for a member of Parliament in the famous session that sat at Edinburgh, when the Duke of Queensberry was commissioner, and in which party spirit ran to such an extremity. The young laird went with his father to the court, and remained in town all the time that the session lasted. And as all interested people of both factions flocked to the town at that period, so the important Mr. Ringham was there among the rest during the greater part of the time, blowing the coal of revolutionary principles with all his might, in every society to which he could obtain admission. He was a great favorite with some of the West County gentlemen of that faction by reason of his unbending impudence. No opposition could for a moment cause him either to blush or retract one item that he had advanced. Therefore the Duke of Argyll and his friends made such use of him as sportsmen often do of terriers, to start the game and make a great yelping noise to let them know whither the chase is proceeding. They often did this out of sport, in order to tease their opponent, for of all pesterers that ever fastened on man, he was the most insufferable. Knowing that his coat protected him from manual chastisement, he spared no acrimony and delighted in the chagrin and anger of those with whom he contended. But he was sometimes likewise of real use to the heads of the Presbyterian faction, and therefore was admitted to their tables, and of course conceived himself a very great man. His ward accompanied him, and very shortly after their arrival in Edinburgh, Robert, for the first time, met with the young laird, his brother, in a match at tennis. The prowess and agility of the young squire drew forth the loudest plaudits of approval from his associates, and his own exertion alone carried the game every time on the one side, and that so far as all along to count 3 for their 1. The hero's name soon ran round the circle, and when his brother Robert, who was an onlooker, learned who it was that was gaining so much applause, he came and stood close beside him all the time that the game lasted, always now and then putting in a cutting remark by way of mockery. George could not help perceiving him, not only on account of his impertinent remarks, but he moreover stood so near him that he several times impeded him in his rapid evolutions, and of course got himself shoved aside in no very ceremonious way. Instead of making him keep his distance, these rude shocks and pushes, accompanied sometimes with hasty curses, only made him cling the closer to this king of the game. He seemed determined to maintain his right to his place as an onlooker, as well as any of those engaged in the game, and if they had tried him at an argument, he would have carried his point, or perhaps he wished to quarrel with this spark of his jealousy and aversion, and draw the attention of the gay crowd to himself by these means. For like his guardian, he knew no other pleasure, but was consistent in opposition. George took him for some impertinent student of divinity, rather set upon a joke than anything else. He perceived a lad with black clothes and a methodistical face, whose countenance and eye he disliked exceedingly, several times in his way, and that was all the notice he took of him for the first time the two met. But the next day and every succeeding one, the same devilish-looking youth attended him as constantly as his shadow, was always in his way as with intention to impede him, and ever and anon his deep and malignant eye met those of his elder brother with a glance so fierce that it sometimes startled him. The very next time that George was engaged at tennis, he had not struck the ball above twice till the same intrusive being was again in his way. The party played for considerable stakes that day, namely a dinner and wine at the Black Bull Tavern, and George, as the hero and head of his party, was much interested in its honor. Consequently, the sight of this moody and hellish-looking student affected him in no very pleasant manner. "Pray, sir, be so good as to keep without the range of the ball," said he. "Is there any law or enactment that can compel me to do so?" said the other, biting his lip with scorn. "If there is not, they are here that shall compel you," returned George. "So, friend, I rede you to be on your guard." As he said this, a flush of anger glowed in his handsome face and flashed from his sparkling blue eye, but it was a stranger to both, and momently took its departure. The black-coated youth set up his cap before, brought his heavy brow over his deep dark eyes, put his hands in the pockets of his black plush breeches, and stepped a little farther into the semicircle immediately on his brother's right hand than he had ever ventured to do before. There he set himself firm on his legs, and with a face as demure as death, seemed determined to keep his ground. He pretended to be following the ball with his eyes, but every moment they were glancing aside at George. One of the competitors chanced to say rashly, in the moment of exultation, "That's a damned fine blow, George," on which the intruder took up the word as characteristic of the competitors and repeated it every stroke that was given, making such a ludicrous use of it that several of the onlookers were compelled to laugh immoderately, but the players were terribly netted at it, as he really contrived, by dint of sliding in some canonical terms, to render the competitors and their game ridiculous. But matters at length came to a crisis that put them beyond sport. George, in flying backward to gain the point at which the ball was going to light, came inadvertently so rudely in contact with this obstreperous interloper that he not only overthrew him, but also got a grievous fall over his legs, and as he arose, the other made a spurn at him with his foot, which, if it had hit its aim, would undoubtedly have finished the course of the young laird at Dalcastle and Balgrennan. George, being irritated beyond measure, as may well be conceived, especially at the deadly stroke aimed at him, struck the assailant with his racket rather slightly, but so that his mouth and nose gushed out blood, and at the same time he said, turning to his cronies, "Does any of you know who the infernal puppy is?" "Do you not know, sir?" said one of the onlookers, a stranger. "The gentleman is your own brother, sir, Mr. Robert Ringham Cowan." "No, not Cowan, sir," said Robert, putting his hands in his pockets and setting himself still farther forward than before. "Not a Cowan, sir. Henceforth I disclaim the name." "No, certainly not," repeated George. "My mother's son you may be, but not a Cowan. There you are right." Then turning round to his informer, he said, "Mercy be about us, sir. Is this the crazy minister's son from Glasgow?" This question was put in the irritation of the moment, but it was too rude and too far out of place, and no one deigned any answer to it. He felt the reproof, and felt it deeply, seeming anxious for some opportunity to make an acknowledgment or some reparation. In the meantime, young Ringham was an object to all the uttermost disgust. The blood flowing from his mouth and nose he took no pains to stem. Neither did he so much as wipe it away, so that it spread over all his cheeks and breasts, even off at his toes. In that state he did take up his station in the middle of the competitors, and he did not now keep his place, but ran about, impeding everyone who attempted to make at the ball. They loaded him with execrations, but it availed nothing. He seemed courting persecution and buffetings, keeping steadfastly to his old joke of damnation, and marring the game so completely that in spite of every effort on the part of the players, he forced them to stop their game and give it up. He was such a rueful-looking object, covered with blood, that none of them had the heart to kick him, although it appeared the only thing he wanted. And as for George, he said not another word to him, either in anger or reproof. When the game was fairly given up, and the party were washing their hands in the stone fount, some of them besought Robert Ringham to wash himself, but he mocked at them and said he was much better as he was. George at length came forward abashedly toward him and said, "I have been greatly to blame, Robert, and am very sorry for what I have done. But in the first instance I erred through ignorance, not knowing you were my brother, which you certainly are, and in the second, through a momentary irritation, for which I am ashamed. I pray you therefore to pardon me and give me your hand." As he said this, he held out his hand toward his polluted brother. But the froward predestinarian took not his from his breeches pocket, but lifting his foot, gave his brother's hand a kick. "I'll give you what will suit such a hand better than mine," said he with a sneer. And then turning lightly about, he added, "Are there to be no more of these damned fine blows, gentlemen? For shame to give up such a profitable and edifying game." "This is too bad," said George, "but since it is thus, I have the less to regret." And having made his general remark, he took no more note of the uncouth aggressor. But the persecution of the latter terminated not on the playground. He ranked up among them, bloody and disgusting as he was, and keeping close to his brother's side, he marched along with the party all the way to the Black Bull. Before they got there, a great number of boys and idle people had surrounded them, hooting and incommoding them exceedingly, so that they were glad to get into the inn. And the unaccountable monster actually tried to get in alongst with them, to make one of the party at dinner. But the innkeeper and his men, getting the hint, by force prevented him from entering, although he attempted it again and again, both by telling lies and offering a bribe. Finding he could not prevail, he set to exciting the mob at the door to acts of violence, in which he had like to have succeeded. The landlord had no other shift at last but to send privately for 2 officers, and have him carried to the guardhouse, and the hilarity and joy of the party of young gentlemen for the evening was quite spoiled by the inauspicious termination of their game. The Reverend Robert Ringham was now to send for, to release his beloved ward. The messenger found him at table with a number of the leaders of the Whig faction, the Marquis of Annandale being in the chair, and the prisoner's note being produced. Ringham read it aloud, accompanying it with some explanatory remarks. The circumstances of the case being thus magnified and distorted, it excited the utmost abhorrence, both of the deed and of the perpetrators, among the assembled faction. They declaimed against the act as an unnatural attempt on the character and even the life of an unfortunate brother who had been expelled from his father's house. And as party spirit was the order of the day, an attempt was made to lay the burden of it to that account. In short, the young culprit got some of the best blood of the land to enter into his securities, and was set at liberty. But when Ringham perceived the plight that he was in, he took him, as he was, and presented him to his honourable patrons. This raised the indignation against the young laird and his associates 1,000-fold, which actually roused the party to temporary madness. They were perhaps a little excited by the wine and spirits they had swallowed, else a casual quarrel between two young men at tennis could not have driven them to such extremes. But certain it is that from one at first arising to address the party on the atrocity of the offence, both in a moral and political point of view, on a sudden there were 6 on their feet at the same time, expatiating on it. And in a very short time thereafter every one in the room was talking with the utmost vociferation on all the same subject, and all taking the same side in the debate. In the midst of this confusion, some one or other issued from the house, which was at the back of the Canongate, calling out, "A plot! A plot! Treason! Treason! Down with the bloody incendiaries at the Black Bull!" The concourse of people that were assembled in Edinburgh at that time was prodigious, and as they were all actuated by political motives, they wanted only a ready-blown coal to set the mountain on fire. The evening being fine, and the streets thronged, the cry ran from mouth to mouth through the whole city. More than that, the mob that had of late been gathered to the door of the Black Bull had by degrees dispersed. But they being young men and idle vagrants, they had only spread themselves over the rest of the street to lounge in search of farther amusement. Consequently, a word was sufficient to send them back to their late rendezvous, where they had previously witnessed something they did not much approve of. The master of the tavern was astonished at seeing this mob again assembling, and that with such hurry and noise, but with his inmates being all of the highest respectability, he judged himself sure of protection, or at least of indemnity. He had 2 large parties in his house at the time, the largest of which was of the revolutionist faction. The other consisted of our young tennis players and their associates, who were all of the Jacobite order, or at all events leaned to the Episcopal side. The largest party were in a front room, and the attack of the mob fell first on their windows, though rather with fear and caution. Jingle went on paying, then a loud hurrah, and that again was followed by a number of voices endeavoring to restrain the indignation from venting itself in destroying the windows, and to turn it on the inmates. The Whigs, calling the landlord, inquired what the assault meant. He cunningly answered that he suspected it was some of the youths of the Cavalier or High Church party exciting the mob against them. The party consisted mostly of young gentlemen, by that time in a key to engage in any row, and at all events to suffer nothing from the other party against whom their passions were mightily inflamed. The landlord, therefore, had no sooner given them the spirit-rousing intelligence than every one as by instinct swore his own natural oath, and grasped his own natural weapon. A few of those of the highest rank were armed with swords, which they boldly drew. Those of the subordinate orders immediately flew to such weapons as the room, kitchen, and scullery afforded, such as tongs, pokers, spits, racks, and shovels, and breathing vengeance on the prelatic party, the children of the Antichrist and the heirs of the damnation, the barterers of the liberties of their country and betrayers of the most sacred trust, thus elevated and thus armed in the cause of right, justice, and liberty, our heroes rushed to the street and attacked the mob with such violence that they broke the mass in a moment, and dispersed their thousands like chaff before the wind. The other party of the young Jacobites, who sat in a room farther from the front, and were those against whom the fury of the mob was meant to have been directed, knew nothing of this second uproar till the noise of the sally made by the Whigs assailed their ears. Being then informed that the mob had attacked the house, on account of the treatment they themselves had given to a young gentleman of the adverse faction, and that another jovial party had issued from the house in their defense, and was now engaged in unequal combat, the sparks likewise flew to their field to back their defenders, and all their prowess, without troubling their heads about who they were. A mob is like a spring tide in an eastern storm, that retires only to return with more overwhelming fury. The crowd was taken by surprise when such a strong and well-armed party issued from the house with so great fury, laying all prostrate that came in their way. Those who were next to the door, and were of course the first whom the imminent danger assailed, rushed backward among the crowd with their whole force. The Black Bull, standing in a small square halfway between the High Street and the Cowgate, and the entrance to it being by two closes, and to these the pressure outward was simultaneous, and thousands were moved to an involuntary flight, they knew not why. But the High Street of Edinburgh, which they soon reached, is a dangerous place in which to make an open attack upon a mob, and it appears that the entrances to the tavern had been somewhere near to the cross, on the south side of the street, for the crowd fled with great expedition, both to the east and west, and the conquerors, separating themselves, as chance directed, pursued impetuously, wounding and maiming as they flew. But it so chanced that before either of the wings had followed the flying squadrons of their enemies for the space of 100 yards each way, the devil, an enemy they had to pursue, the multitude had vanished like so many thousands of phantoms. What could our heroes do? Why, they faced about to return toward their citadel, the Black Bull. But that feat was not so easily nor so readily accomplished as they divined. The unnumbered alleys on each side of the street had swallowed up the multitude in a few seconds, but from these they were busy reconnoitering, and perceiving the deficiency in the number of their assailants, the rush from both sides of the street was as rapid and as wonderful as the disappearance of the crowd had been a few minutes before. Each close vomited out its levies, and these better armed with missiles than when they sought it for a temporary retreat. Woe then to our two columns of victorious Whigs! The mob actually closed around them as they would have swallowed them up, and in the meanwhile shower after shower of the most abominable weapons of offense were rained in upon them. If the gentlemen were irritated before, this inflamed them still farther. But their danger was now so apparent, they could not shut their eyes on it. Therefore both parties, as if actuated by the same spirit, made a desperate effort to join, and the greater part effected it. But some were knocked down, and others were separated from their friends, and blithe to become silent members of the mob. The battle now raged immediately in front of the closes leading to the Black Bull. The small body of Whig gentlemen was hardly bested, and it is likely would have been overcome and trampled down every man, had they not been then and there joined by the young cavaliers, who, fresh to arms, broke from the wind, opened the head of the passage, laid about them manfully, and thus kept up the spirits of the exasperated Whigs, who were the men in fact that wrought the most array among the populace. The town guard was now on the alert, and 2 companies of the Cameronian regiment and the honorary Captain Douglas rushed down from the castle to the scene of action. But for all the noise and hubbub that these caused in the street, the combat had become so close and inveterate that numbers of both sides were taken prisoners, fighting hand to hand, and could scarcely be separated when the guardsmen and soldiers held them by their necks. Great was the alarm and confusion that night in Edinburgh, for everyone concluded that it was a party scuffle, and the 2 parties being so equal in power, the most serious consequences were anticipated. The agitation was so prevailing that every party in the town, great and small, was broken up, and the Lord Commissioner thought proper to go to the council chamber himself, even at that late hour, accompanied by the sheriffs of Edinburgh and Linlithgow, with sundry noblemen besides, in order to learn something of the origin of the affray. For a long time the court was completely puzzled. Every gentleman brought and exclaimed against the treatment he had received in most bitter terms, blaming a mob set on him and his friends by the adverse party, and matters looked extremely ill, until at length they began to perceive that they were examining gentlemen of both parties, and that they had been doing so from the beginning, almost alternately, so equally had the prisoners been taken from both parties. Finally, it turned out that a few gentlemen, 2/3 of whom were strenuous Whigs themselves, had joined in mauling the whole Whig population of Edinburgh. The investigation disclosed nothing the effect of which was not ludicrous, and the Duke of Queensberry, whose aims was at one time to conciliate the 2 factions, tried all that he could to turn the whole fracas into a joke, an unlucky frolic, where no ill was meant on either side, and which yet had been productive of a great deal. The greater part of the people went home satisfied, but not so the Reverend Robert Ringham. He did all that he could to inflame both judges and populace against the young cavaliers, especially against the young Laird of Delcastle, whom he represented as an incendiary set on by an unnatural parent to slander his mother, and make away with a hapless and only brother. And in truth that declaimer against all human merit had that sort of powerful, homely, and bitter eloquence which seldom missed affecting his hearers. The consequence at that time was that he made the unfortunate affair between the two brothers appear in extremely bad colors, and the populace retired to their homes impressed with no very favorable opinion of either the Laird of Delcastle or his son George, neither of whom were there present to speak for themselves. As for Ringham himself, he went home to his lodgings, filled with gall and with spite against the young laird, whom he had made to believe the aggressor, and that intentionally. But most of all was he filled with indignation against the father, whom he held in abhorrence at all times and blamed solely for his unmannerly attack made on his favorite ward, namesake and adopted son, and for the public imputation of a crime to his own reverence, in calling the lad his son, and thus charging him with a sin against which he was well known to have levelled all the arrows of church censure with unsparing might. But filled as his heart was with some portion of these bad feelings, to which all flesh is subject, he kept, nevertheless, the fear of the Lord always before his eyes, so far as never to omit any of the external duties of religion, and farther than that, man hath no power to pry. He lodged with the family of a Mr. Miller, whose lady was originally from Glasgow, and had been a hearer and of course a great admirer of Mr. Ringham. In that family he made public worship every evening, and that night, in his petitions at a throne of grace, he prayed for so many vials of wrath to be poured on the head of some particular sinner, that the hearers trembled and stopped their ears. But that he might not proceed with so violent a measure amounting to excommunication, without due scripture warrant, he began the exercise of the evening by singing the following verses, which it is a pity should never have been admitted into Christian psalmody, being so adverse to all its mild and benevolent principles. Set thou the wicked over him, and upon his right hand give thou his greatest enemy, even Satan, leave to stand. And when by thee he shall be judged, let him remember be, and let his prayer be turned to sin, when he shall call on thee. Few be his days, and in his room his charge another take. His children let be fatherless, his wife a widow make. Let God his father's wickedness still to remembrance call, and never let his mother's sin be blotted out at all. As he in cursing pleasure took, so let it to him fall. As he delighted not to bless, so bless him not at all. As cursing he like clothes put on, into his bowels sow, like water into his bones, like oil down let it go. Young Ringham only knew the full purport of this spiritual song, and went to his bed better satisfied than ever, that his father and brother were castaways, reprobates, aliens from the church and the true faith, and cursed in time and eternity. This is the end of Part 1 of the editor's narrative from The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner by James Hogg. Thank you for listening.